As we've already heard this week, troops marched their way across the islands, only to be met with fierce fighting in the mountains on the approach to Stanley. Liberation Day began this morning with a service of remembrance and thanksgiving at Stanley Cathedral. Islanders, veterans and visitors gathered, each with their own thoughts and memories from 30 years ago uppermost in their minds. The day started clear and dry with a forecast of snow later, just as there had been in 1982. The population in Stanley has been swelled by locals coming into the capital from outlying settlements who wanted to pay their own respects. This was a service which sought to steer that middle ground between celebration and commemoration. There are still many veterans who still bear the mental and physical scars of the Falklands conflict. There are relatives who still mourn loved ones who gave their lives for the freedom of this place. And there were those 3 islanders too who lost their lives in the final days of the fighting, and others who were imprisoned not knowing what their fate would be. The mood was summed up by the Reverend Richard Hines, the rector of Stanley Cathedral.
30 years on, I for one have grown increasingly aware how very close to the surface all this has become again for many of you. For veterans among us who yonked and carried and dug and fought to liberate these islands.
After the service, British forces paraded down the harbour front from the cathedral to the Falklands Memorial, where tribute will be paid to the 258 people who lost their lives in the conflict. Well, more on the Liberation Day commemorations on tomorrow's programme. Well, I've moved inside Government House now and I'm joined by Foreign Office Minister Jeremy Browne, who's the government's representative here this week throughout the commemorations. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme today. Let's start with today. Obviously, it's about the valour and sacrifice of 30 years ago, but is there a message to the wider world today, in particular Argentina?
Well, I think today is about a celebration of the liberation of the islands. And the islanders certainly feel that very keenly themselves and hugely appreciate what was done on their behalf 30 years ago. I think it's also about a more sombre commemoration of the people who died, whose bravery made today possible. But there is a contemporary, as you say, political dimension to it as well. And we want to send a very clear, emphatic signal to Argentina in particular, but to the wider world, that we hold dear the principle of self-determination and that the future of the Falkland Islands is for the Falkland Islands people to decide for themselves.
Let's talk about the referendum that was announced earlier this week. You would expect it to be an almost unanimous pro-British result of that referendum. Will Argentina then simply say we've rigged it?
Well, there will be provision for international observers and others, so I don't think it would be fair to say there won't be legitimate, I think, grounds for saying that the result is rigged. But look, this is the crucial point about the referendum. There are people who say to us and to others, look, how do we know that the Falkland Islanders have this passionate view about their own future, their own status, if you like, their own stance? So this is an opportunity for them to speak for themselves. You
talked there about the wider world and the message getting across. You've also said that Argentina have been domineering in their attitude to the Falklands over the last few weeks. How else, apart from the referendum, do we attempt to get that message across to the opinion formers around the world?
Well, I think it's important that people understand the point of view of the Falkland Islanders. And what is really significant today, for example, is the President of Argentina is in New York putting the Argentinian case against the Falkland Islanders. But the representatives of the Falkland Islands, both the formal representatives who've been elected, but also young people who represent the next generation of Falkland Islanders, have gone to New York to explain why they value their self-determination.
Should the Prime Minister be there?
Well, no, the Prime Minister is got his engagements that he has to undertake in London, but the Prime Minister will be speaking at the 30th anniversary commemorative event in London, and he will be making the position of the British government emphatically clear. In fact, as I understand it, the flag of the Falkland Islands is flying above Downing Street and government buildings in London today, so it couldn't be more clear-cut.
The military presence here in the Falkland Islands has been an enduring one over the last 30 years, of course, but it hasn't really changed much during that time. Are you satisfied that there is enough of a presence here at the moment?
There should be no doubt at all in Argentina or elsewhere that it's for real, that we want to make sure that the people of these islands have the right to self-determination, and we have said to them that we will do what we need to do in order to make sure that we maintain that right for you. So this isn't just a symbolic presence, it's a real presence, and it's a real presence because we shouldn't lightly forget that 30 years ago this stopped being military theory and this became reality, and hundreds of British soldiers died recapturing these islands, and we have to make sure that we're not put in that position again. So there is a military presence here, It's a significant military presence and it's here for a purpose.
Minister, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. Well, let's hear now from some veterans of the Falklands conflict, many of whom have come over especially for the commemorations this week, but some have settled here. Liberty Lodge was opened in Stanley in 2007 and offers ex-servicemen a chance to return to the islands. For the 30th anniversary, the lodge is full of veterans swapping stories over endless cups of tea. A former Royal Marine, Gary Clement, was stationed here before the war, fought in it and settled here over 20 years ago. He's now chairman of the South Atlantic Medals Association.
For 10, 12 years I've been helping bring veterans back to the islands, and you know, just seeing what it can do for those veterans is amazing, to be honest with you. You know, I've had guys that have come back here that can hardly talk, that leave a week later. It's the best pill you can give somebody, is to be able to return.
For many, returning to the place where they witnessed firsthand the horrors of war is incredibly difficult. Others, like Kenny Ward, can't wait to get back. This is his third trip since 1982, and he says while the effects of the conflict are long-lasting, the impact of the islands themselves are even more profound.
The day of the surrender and after the surrender, this place was hell on earth. It really was. It was something that I'd never, as a young 20-year-old, I'd never thought could ever, I would ever experience that kind of carnage and destruction, you know. That kind of commitment by the islanders to recognise a very, very small part that we played in liberating this island will stay with me for the rest of my life. And so much so that I've came back twice since then. I'm going to come back to this island as ashes, and I'm going to have my ashes spread from the top of Sapperhill, because I feel that there's such a magnetism, and I'm drawn to the island and the people, that I was a part of this island 30 years ago, but I want to be a part of it permanently.
Falklands veterans talking to me a little bit earlier on, and talking of veterans, I know Kate has been talking to another in the studio.
Yes, good evening. Well, joining me in the studio is Major General Julian Thompson, who commanded 3 commando brigades which retook the Falklands. Welcome, General. Just take us back 30 years and tell us your memories of this day.
Well, in the afternoon of this day, I was walking into Stanley on the heels of 2 Para with my attack headquarters, and a helicopter flew overhead, and I thought it was a British helicopter. I thought that was General Moore on his way to take the surrender. So I decided I'd walk forward, and I was going with the retreating Argentine army, who looked at me somewhat curiously. They didn't stop me. And outside the Secretariat building was a very smart Argentine officer who spoke perfect English, and the reason he spoke perfect English was because he'd been to the British Army Staff College. And he said, "What do you want, Brigadier?" very politely in English. And I said, "Is my general in there?" And he said, "No, but mine is," talking to 2 officers. And I knew who they were, that one of them was Mike Rose and the other was the Spanish interpreter, and talking to his general. I didn't want to destroy the rapport which I hoped was being established, and I turned on my heels and walked off. And because we had nowhere to go, all our kit was miles away, we had just what we were carrying, my Chief of Staff, who joined me, begged a room off a house which B Company 2 Para had requisitioned, and I was given this room to live in and set up as my headquarters.
And at what point did you know the Argentines had surrendered?
Well, what happened was I was in this room in the darkness because there was no electricity, and one of my radio operators switched his HF set to the BBC World Service. And he heard on the BBC World Service, 8,000 miles away, about the surrender happening 800 yards from where I was standing.
You must have pinched yourself and thought...
Well, I did. I thought, is this true? Or is it, you know, just nonsense? And eventually, about an hour later, the interpreter, who was a British Royal Marine officer, came to find me. He'd been trying to find me for the last half hour. And I said, "What's happened? Is this true?" And he said, "Yes, it's true. They surrendered."
Nothing must beat that feeling you had in that moment when you realised that you'd won.
Absolutely, and it wasn't just winning. I knew then that no more young men on either side would die.
So how does it make you feel today when you know that the Argentinian government still lays claim to the Falklands? Even today you have the president at the UN Committee on Decolonisation asserting their rights to the Falklands.
Well, I'm afraid it's in the Argentine DNA. They believe the Malvinas, as they call it, belongs to them, and nothing that we do or say will change that. And what we have to say all the time is there's nothing to discuss over that. There's plenty to discuss about oil, but not about that. It is up to the islanders to decide where and who they want to be ruled by, and they want self-government under the British Crown.
So how did you react to the news this week that the islanders will have a referendum where they can say once and for all what they want?
I was delighted, because it meant that it's out in the public domain, because there's so much rhetoric coming from South America, and backed, I might say, by some supporters in Europe and in America itself. And the islanders hardly get a look in. And people actually say to me, even today, what about the Argentines who live in the islands? And I say there aren't any Argentines living in the islands, they're all British.
In 1982, there were so many commentators who said Britain couldn't do this alone, and in the way that they did. Do you think they could do a similar thing again today, should they need to?
Well, I have to say that back then, the MOD thought it couldn't be done in 1982. The MOD had done a study, and they came up with the answer that it couldn't be done. They put it in a box marked impossible.
Did you think it could be done?
I was quite sure we could do it, yeah.
And what about today? Well,
today, I don't think it's going to happen to begin with, because the islanders are much better protected than they were then. My worry is in 10, 20, even 30 years' time, when things have changed, money is tight again, we just say, OK, well, we'll just reduce our garrison or whatever, because these sort of things do happen. And perhaps the Argentines are getting more aggressive, and perhaps they've acquired the ability to retake them. Then I would question our ability to take them back without a carrier. But we have much better ships now. The Type 45 frigates and our submarines, I think actually we probably could do it again.
When you look back at 30 years, how strong are your memories, especially in terms of the people you lost?
Well, they're very strong. I think about them every day. And of course I'm reminded of them when I go to reunions, where I was, for example, only this weekend, and we had a service in the Memorial Garden where we remembered some of the people who've been lost and their then wives and now children who are aged 30 and 40 were there, and it's as fresh in their minds as it is in mine.
And briefly, a message for those men you commanded on this day today.
Well, what I said to them when I was speaking to them only the day before yesterday, which is, you did it. The generals and admirals may make brilliant plans, but the people that make it happen are the Marines and soldiers and sailors and airmen. They did it.
Major General Julian Thompson, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, some of those veterans have been marking today's anniversary in the UK. Tim Cooper has been at the military cemetery in Aldershot and spoke to two servicemen about their memories of the conflict.
Major Sully Al-Haji at the grave of one of his best friends, a fellow para who lost his life just a few days before the end of the Falklands War. 18 Falklands fallen lie at the peaceful Aldershot military cemetery, and for their comrades it brings memories back of the islands 30 years ago today.
Shock and awe when we watched Stanley and you saw half the houses blown away, the smell of cordite, the smell of death. It was just a horrible kind of gloomy atmosphere, but there was the behind the scenes joy of we've won, we've liberated these people. So it was mixed feelings. I wanted to laugh, I wanted to cry, because then you're thinking about your friends and colleagues who died.
In the army for almost 39 years, Major Mike Kelly knew many of these men, and he's explaining to me their stories. This 30th anniversary for him is all about those he knew.
I just remember the individuals frozen in time as they were, you know, when they were killed. Many of those people behind us, certainly from 2 para, junior NCOs, you know, junior NCOs doing their job, leading their sections, you know, in attacks and paying the ultimate price for it. And I remember those guys who are my contemporaries, you know, frozen in time, what they were like and the good times that we had.
1,000 Falklands veterans will gather at this cemetery on Sunday to remember all of their comrades who fell 30 years ago. Tim Cooper, Forces News, Aldershot.